I did not grow up in a Christian home. We were culturally Christian, and my mother kind of hauled my sister and me into Mount Olive Lutheran Church a few times a year, but I really had no idea why or what was going on. There was really no catechesis involved because our family religion was sailing. So whenever the weather was nice, which was most of the time in Southern California, we were on our boat on the weekends. And as a teenager with a car and a strong curiosity, which can be a dangerous thing, I found myself in bookstores, and I found myself drawn to Eastern religions and New Age kinds of religious books. And the result of that is that I ended up getting very much into a New Age belief system, which persisted for many, many years. And I eventually, in my mid-30s, did have the tremendous blessing of finding Christ and, I guess, having a real conversion experience, at least partway. And when I hit 50, I had this tremendous wave of gratitude. For those of you who are not yet old enough to have experienced this, I don't know if anyone else has, but it's kind of like, wow, my kids are almost all grown. I'm over halfway done with my life. And I'm so profoundly grateful for so many things. First grandchild is born. It's just like a real significant moment. And one of the things I reflected on being so grateful for was faith, my faith in Christ. And I thought I probably wouldn't be alive right now, let alone be alive and happy, if I had not had that. So I was just profoundly grateful. And I was curious, how is it, that I came to this later in life? And I reflected on my youth. And I identified two things from my childhood that I think had a very, very strong effect, cultivating the soil, if you will, so that the seeds of the gospel could take root in my heart. And those two things were, number one, I spent a tremendous amount of time in nature. The side benefit of having a boat and spending a lot of time on the ocean and over at Catalina Island, I was hiking and swimming and out, and a lot of that time I was in solitude, this experience of solitude in nature. And I was very, very privileged this way. And I think that had a great impact on my soul. And I actually wrote a talk. I stole the title from a book, Nature Deficit Disorder by Richard Louv, and I created a talk about the importance of nature in terms of that cultivating the soil of the soul. The other thing that I reflected on was my reading. So I went to public schools. I do not remember any books that we read in school, except high school. There are a few really bad ones that I remember being really bad and disturbing. But I don't remember the books we read in elementary, middle school. I do, however, remember my bookshelf in my room, which consisted of the World Book Encyclopedia, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and the complete fairy tale series edited by Andrew Lang. Do any of you know this? The yellow fairy tale book, the orange fairy tale. I had the whole spectrum. And I spent most of my childhood, probably from the time I could read until I could drive, just reading those books, the World Book, Tolkien, and fairy tales. And I would read fairy tales. I would read them again and again and again. And this didn't come to me quite as easily. There was a moment when this happened. I was sitting in a church, and I travel a lot and do a lot of events in churches. This was a particularly ugly church. Right, it was just bad 70s architecture, and it was just brown and ugly. And it had all these banners all around the wall. And so I'm just sitting there waiting for things to happen, whatever. I'm reading these banners, right? And the one I remember, it said, Christ the King. And I remember going through this weird thought, emotional reaction to this banner. My first reaction to it was, I don't like that. Well, immediately I felt guilty. Why? What is it about me and my soul and my mind and my heart that doesn't like Christ the King? And then I thought, well, actually, I do like that, but I feel guilty for liking it. So I was a little bit confused, and then I finally parsed it out. I didn't like it because I'm an American. We are trained from a young age to not like kings. In fact, our entire country was founded on the idea of get out from under the authority of a king. And if you read history, almost all the kings are bad. I mean, even if you read the Bible, there's a whole lot of kings that are pretty bad. And so my mindset about king is, why would anyone want one? They're supposed to be bad. But then I realized at a deeper place in my heart, I love kings. In fact, I have secretly wanted to live in a kingdom. I would love to live in a country with a king. I would even be happy if there was a queen. I wanted to be a subject of the British Empire just for that. Now she's gone. I don't really care anymore. But I thought, now that's kind of weird. What is it about my imagination that is attracted to kings? And I started reflecting on all this, and I thought, well, you know, you're an American, I'm an American, and that's a huge amount of programming. So what overcame that? And then I realized the truth of king, of kingness, the truth of what a king is in reality is not found in history books. It's found in fairy tales, right? Because in fairy tales, kings love their people and make sacrifices for their people, and the people love their king and make sacrifices for their king. This is the proper, ordered relationship between people and kings. And if there is a bad king, he is to be deposed, but he is replaced not with a democracy, but with the true king. And when I flashed on this, I thought, aha, this is very powerful. And in my life, I'm pretty sure that fairy tales were part of the cultivation of the soil of my soul that allowed the gospel to take root and flourish. So I began a study of fairy tales. I bought about 8 books on fairy tales, both by Christian authors and non-Christian authors, pro-fairy tale, anti-fairy tale. I will mention a few of them. And I'm always cautious when I mention books in talks because I don't want you to write it down and buy all those books you're never going to read. But I do like to give credit where credit is due. So I will mention a few books simply so you can know that I got that idea from somewhere. But this idea of truth, like capital T, like eternal truth, it seems as though in my view, there's more truth in fairy tales than there could be in history books. I mean, that sounds odd, but history books are always written by someone with an agenda. You may or may not agree with their agenda. You may like it or not like it, but there's no history books that aren't written by someone who's got a particular angle or view or belief system or worldview that's embedded in there somewhere. Whereas it seems to me that fairy tales have a level of purity and clarity that have eternal value. And so the first thing I read, and I would recommend this for anyone, you don't have to buy a book, it's public domain, you can get it for free online, is a chapter in Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton called The Ethics of Elfland. If you have not read The Ethics of Elfland, It's like Chesterton, short but dense, not easy but tremendously rewarding. And in that, he makes this statement. He says, "We do not read fairy tales to children so that they learn that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. We read them fairy tales so that they can learn dragons can be slain." And that just so resonated with me, because you can't live and not be aware of evil. You can mentally deny the existence of it, but you can't be completely unaware of the existence of evil. And it's an epistemological problem for everyone, right? How do you understand this? And so when we touch on fairy tales, we touch on this world of clarity about good and evil that helps to form what I believe Russell Kirk coined the term, and many people have used it in other ways. I'm using it this way: the moral imagination. The idea to inject your consciousness into a story or a situation and know, or be able to think at least, about what's right, what's wrong, what should be, what shouldn't be. The other thing that he talks about in Ethics of Elfland is wonder. And I am having a renewed excitement about rediscovering wonder through the eyes of grandchildren. If you do not yet have grandchildren, let me assure you that it is the absolute best thing that will ever happen to you. It is by far the best thing about getting old. But there's something amazing, because when you have your own children, you're still so young, you're basically growing up while you're trying to raise children, and then by the time you've kind of figured stuff out, they're gone. But when you have grandchildren, you have that lifetime of wisdom and perspective, and you don't have the pressure, right? You don't have to guide and instruct and supervise and educate them in the same way. You're free. You're free to enjoy them, to observe them, to enter into their world. And this sense of wonder is so powerful. Chesterton said, "We like astonishing tales because they touch the ancient instinct of astonishment." That we are wired for wonder. A tree is magical by its nature because it produces fruit. Right? It's truly astounding when you think about it. I think it was Chesterton also said it's far more astonishing, far more wonderful, amazing that an egg turns into a chicken than that a frog turns into a prince. And so when we read these stories, they will both entertain and enlighten us. Very, very good book called Once Upon a Time Saints by Ethel Pachoki, I believe is her name, Pachoki. She says, "Fairy tales clear the way for sanctity. They are the child's first morality play. Clear-cut, no nonsense, black and white, good and evil, life and death, with a bit of fun thrown in to alleviate the pain." And you know, when you hang out with children and you look at stuff they've never seen before, if it's animals, the first thing they'll ask you, is it dangerous? Will it hurt you? Right? And they'll watch a movie, or they'll hear a story, and they'll stop and say, "Is that a good guy or a bad guy?" Because they're starting to sort these things out. Now, obviously, the truth, as Chesterton said, what's wrong with the world? I am, right? There's good and bad in all of us. But if we can't learn to recognize it, then we end up falling into the very dangerous trap of denying its existence. So we know certain things are true. Not just that kings should love their people and people should love their king. We also know that trolls and goblins and witches and what else? Monsters of all sorts are evil and they should be killed. That's what happens in a story. We learn some very important things. For example, this is a super important thing for girls to learn. A frog could turn out to be a prince, and a prince could turn out to be a frog. And you have to think beyond the appearance of things, or you can make bad decisions. We know that magic is real. What's so interesting to me about technology is that you could take pretty much any technology we take for granted and go back just a very short time, 100 years ago, and it would have just been magic. It would have been inconceivable that science could do that, right? And so there's this world between technology and magic. But more than that, you think about the power of, say, wishes and magic, right? What you wish for has tremendous power in your life. And we can unpack that a little bit later. One of the criticisms of fairy tales is that they give false promise, false hope. The idea of the Cinderella syndrome, the girls who grow up with fairy tales are going to think Prince Charming will come, and that's never going to happen. You're never going to have true love, and you're just setting people up for disappointment and failure. Well, that's not true. Now, will everyone experience true love in a human sense? Maybe not, right? But there is a lover of your soul who will love you forever, and you will live forever. And depending on the choices you make, you will either live happily ever after or something less than that. So the fairy tales are just oozing with supernatural truth. And I have really wanted to try and help people navigate this world because there's a lot of confusion. And in particular, children's literature today. I think this is one of the hardest times for a mom to choose books for her children to read and learn from. So one of the most valuable things that I learned in this regard was from another speaker in another talk, Oliver DeMille, and I don't think he thought of it. He got it from somewhere else. So I don't know where this originated. You probably could find it going back hundreds or maybe thousands of years. But 4 types of stories, 4 kind of general categories. And of course, many stories are hybrids, and they have elements that are blended together in different ways. But for purposes of analysis and thinking, I believe it's very useful for us to learn these 4 types, and then it becomes a filter for some of the decisions that we have to make. What then shall we read? What then shall we give to our children to read? So the first type of story is whole, W-H-O-L-E, complete, perfect. Whole in the sense that the story portrays good as good and evil as evil. There's no equivocation. It's very clear, and good wins. This would be a whole story. Probably the oldest story, you find a version of this in almost every culture going back to the very beginning, is some version of Cinderella. Oppressed innocence, right, suffers, but then gains a supernatural opportunity to do good and is rewarded in that innocence and goodness, right? So Cinderella, you see this because it's very clear. Good is good, bad is bad, good wins. Now, if you're going to read Cinderella with boys, you obviously want to choose the right version because some of the fairy tales have been kind of watered down a bit, and others have been seriously distorted by movie-making enterprises. But for boys, you probably want to go back to the original Perrault version because, it's romance, right? And so 10-year-old boys they're not going to tune in so well unless you have a little bit of violence. So in the original Cinderella, the emissary of the prince comes to try on the slipper, which was not glass. Try on the slipper to the stepsisters. Now, one of the stepsisters, in order to fit her foot into the slipper, cuts off the top of her toe, and then blood oozes out into the slipper, thus exposing her as a fraud. The other stepsister, in order to fit her foot into the slipper, cuts off the back of her heel, which then causes blood to ooze out into the slipper, thereby exposing her as a fraud. And of course, my question is, why would anyone want to put their foot in this blood-soaked slipper? But nevertheless, so that's it. This is probably the most dominant and popular form of story that you encounter anywhere. In fact, I'm going to tell you the plot of a movie. I'm guessing 7-8 years ago, this movie came out. I think I was living in Oklahoma when we saw it. And I want you to see if you can figure out what movie this is, okay? So here's the plot. Evil arises. People suffer. A reluctant savior appears. The savior is captured and put literally into the pit of hell, from which he rises up amazingly, defeats the evil, order is restored, and the savior disappears. Do you recognize this story? The Rise of the Dark Knight. Batman. In fact, pretty much every superhero movie follows this. Why do people keep going to superhero movies? It defies logic because you know what's going to happen, right? You know the superhero is going to defeat the evil. So why sit through it? The acting isn't that good. We sit through it for the same reason that children crave these types of whole stories, where the dragon is slain and the princess is rescued and the good is rewarded and the evil is punished. Why? Because that is the ultimate truth of existence, right? And we need to be continuously reminded of this because we don't see it every day. We don't see every day good rewarded and evil punished. We don't see the same kind of justice. We don't see the victory that we hope for. And sometimes we see the opposite. But the stories keep us tuned in to the truth that we know. Because in the end, good wins. We don't know when. We don't know how long it will take. We don't know necessarily what our role or job is in the whole thing. But we do have faith. And that narrative again and again and again reinforces that truth of existence. So we really love whole stories. Children love whole stories. In fact, children at a certain age are very disturbed if any story isn't a whole story like that. But then there are other stories that are also very helpful to us. The next category or type would be healing stories. So we have whole, healing. Healing stories are where good is good and bad is bad, clear as day, and good doesn't win. But there is redemption. Some form of redemption happens. I would say the master of this particular genre that I am aware of is Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote 2 stories that are perfect in this regard. One of them is so hard to read, I cannot actually read it anymore without crying at the end. This is the other thing, oh young people, that will happen to you. Once you hit about 50, you're just gonna cry for reasons you cannot explain. But it's The Little Match Girl. And so it's the holiday eve in the middle of winter. She's poor. She has to go out and sell matches and get a few coins, because if she comes home with no coins, she'll be beaten. And she's out there, and then she loses a shoe, and the boy steals a shoe, and she's cold, and she doesn't even have a coat, and it's icy snow, and she's standing there, and nobody's buying matches because there's just one going by in their busy holiday life, right? And she lights a little match just for a moment of warmth. And things change a little bit. And then she lights another match, and she lights all the matches. And the whole wall next to her becomes translucent. And she sees this incredible glowing beauty, her grandmother welcoming her. Essentially the beatific vision. And then the last paragraph or so of the story, they find her cold, frozen, dead body on the street, stiff as a board. Just like, you killed her. You killed this poor, innocent young girl who suffered nothing but misery her whole life, and now she's dead. How horrible. But she's not dead. She experienced that transfer of self. She is in heaven. And that's the truth of it. And that type of story helps us realize that, yes, you can have horrible suffering on earth. And many people do. And you can't explain it naturally, so easily. But that's not eternity. That's not what it's all about. What it's really about is eternity and heaven. It's an amazing, and it's very short. The other one Hans Christian Andersen did so well is The Little Mermaid. Now, if you haven't read The Little Mermaid, it's longer. It's about, 15, 17 pages. You should read it just to disabuse yourself of the horrible Disney perversion of it, because it's completely different, right? So in the real Little Mermaid story, okay, so she gets old enough to have the opportunity to go up above the water, and she sees the prince. She falls in love with the prince. She saves his life, right? And then she goes back down, and she really wants to come back and be with this prince because she loves him. And so she goes to the sea witch, and the sea witch trades her tongue for the ability to walk on land. That's weird. It's this barter, it's this trade. And, I think if Disney had included this, we would have been saved from a lot of bad songs because she couldn't have sung them with no tongue. But the side effect, of course, is she couldn't talk. And so she ends up hanging out with this prince, and it's very painful. In fact, Andersen describes it that every step she takes on the earth is like knives cutting into the soles of her feet. Like it is a continuous sacrificial experience of pain for her to be with this prince. And she loves him, but he does not love her back. In fact, he doesn't know that she's the one that saved him. He actually thinks this other girl saved him, and she can't tell him the truth because no tongue. So he kind of keeps her around as a pet, a friend, an accoutrement, while he's planning to marry this other girl. Meanwhile, she's becoming more and more and more not a mermaid because she's spending all this time outside the water. And I guess according to the laws of mermaidness, mermaids do not live forever. They live for 300 years, and then they dissolve into foam on the sea, and their identity ceases to exist. But if she marries the prince, then she is bound to his soul in a supernatural way, and she will acquire an immortal soul and be able to live forever. Wow, what if Disney had put that in the movie? But it's like the supernatural power of the sacrament of matrimony. Well, it gets worse. Because finally, the prince is marrying this other girl, and she's there, and she's been out of the water so long, I guess, that now if he does marry this other girl, she has no chance to marry him, but she can't go back to being a mermaid, so as the sun rises, she will dissolve into foam on the sea and cease to exist. So her sisters go to the sea witch, and they trade their hair for a dagger, a magic dagger. And they bring it to her and give her this knife and say, if you will plunge this dagger into that prince and drip his blood on your feet, you will change back into a mermaid, and you can live your 300 years with us happily as a mermaid and not dissolve into foam tomorrow. So she takes the dagger, and the prince and his beloved are asleep, and she looks at him, and she has the dagger, and she realizes that she cannot do this. She loves him more than herself. And so she throws the dagger into the ocean. The sun peeps over the horizon, and she begins to dissolve into foam on the sea. But because of her act of sacrificial love, the invisible spirits of the air swoop her up and tell her that because she has made this great act of sacrificial love, she has earned the right to serve with them, invisible spirits of the air, for 300 years, and if she does so faithfully, she will earn an immortal soul. And then there's a bit of moralizing, and there's a debate about whether Hans Christian Andersen really wrote this at the end, but then there's this little bit that says, and every time a child is good, the 300 years is shortened, but every time a child is bad, the 300 years is lengthened. Which I think is a very interesting kind of allusion to, I don't know, purgatory or something. But that story is so rich. It just drips sacramental truth. And Andersen was not a perfect person, as no authors were. And sometimes people point to him and maybe some moral failings that he had. But he did say almost the same thing that Handel said about writing the Messiah. The stories descended into his mind, fully formed. There was a level of inspiration there that you just don't necessarily imagine would be possible. So I highly recommend The Little Mermaid, but not for young children, right? It's really a story for adolescents and above. And yet, it's healing, right? These are healing stories because good doesn't win. Things don't work out the way you hope. Maybe they even die, but there's a higher truth. There's a higher good. And then we are healed by reaffirming that in our imaginations. Now, the third type of a story is the broken story. A broken story is where good is good and bad is bad, and bad wins. We don't like these for the most part. Probably one of the best examples that you would be familiar with is Jekyll and Hyde, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Stevenson. This is a very interesting story because it portrays for you in vivid and horrid detail the consequences of succumbing to addiction and lust, right? And lust for power. So it's funny, I was reading this book with a teenage daughter, and we were reading it and talking about it and writing in the margins and having a good, meaningful, homeschool style literature discussion. And my son walks in and he says, "What are you guys reading?" And I said, "Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde." And he said, "Oh, I read that. I hated it." Well, my first reaction was, "You're totally dyslexic. You've never read a book in your life. How did you do this?" And I said, "You read it?" And he said, well, I listened to it. Somehow this book got on his iPod and he listened to this story at too young of an age. And I said, okay, so you hated it. Why? And he said these words, nothing good happens, which is exactly correct. Nothing good happens in that story. So why have the story, right? Why have a story where evil wins and death is the outcome and there's no hope or healing? Well, because pretty much every human being, starting right around adolescence, is going to have to wrestle with those same forms of temptation, of addiction and lust and desire and craving and the powerful draw of evil. Another one that you may also be familiar with, or maybe even more familiar with, at least I was, because it was one of the very bad books I had to read in high school, is Lord of the Flies, right? Nothing good happens. Well, what's the value of that book? Well, this is where you have to inject yourself into the story and ask the questions. If I had been in this, would I have done what the character did? Could I have not done what that character did? Why and how would I help to do something different that would improve or solve this situation somehow? And so these broken stories are effective at essentially exposing our own dark side, helping us see it objectively and clearly, and then fortify ourselves against that. But again, you don't want to read stories like Jekyll and Hyde or Lord of the Flies to children who are too young, because then it can be disturbing. So that's the third type. So we have whole, healing, broken. The fourth type is twisted. Twisted stories are stories where good is portrayed as evil and or evil is portrayed as good. There's a twisting of that happening. Probably a good example of this that I am personally familiar with. I am not proud of this fact, but when I was a teenager with a car and very little parental supervision in high school, I would often travel with other people down to the beach theater at midnight to watch a particular movie that was shown every Saturday night, the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Some of you are old enough to know this. And of course, this is a totally twisted thing. And the innocence and good is portrayed as stupid, and the evil is glorified. And so it's a very disordering, but it's a subtle and almost comfortable disordering because it's all couched in humor and music, right? And so and we all memorized the dialogue and it was a cult flick. But doing that again and again and again, very damaging, very damaging. I survived it somehow. Probably a worse version of a totally twisted story, probably the first one that got any real traction was A Clockwork Orange, where you have the glorification of absolute evil and violence. And that's pretty extreme. Most people can't handle that level of twistedness. But we do very often fall into appreciating lesser forms of twistedness, especially if they are embedded in some other kind of story. You've probably noticed or read or seen someone comment on kind of how Disney movies over the years have trivialized or portrayed as increasingly stupid and irrelevant parents, and kind of glorified young people's rebellion, against those stupid parents. And so you see that that's a very subtle, and it could be inside a plot where, yeah, good wins, and so we all laugh and it's happy ending, but there's that subtle twisting that occurs. So what we'll see then is that, stories can be mixed, right? A really good example of a hybrid story here is Anna Karenina, which I would argue is the best novel. Well, I couldn't say ever written because I haven't read every novel that's ever been written, but I would say it's the best novel I have ever read. And it's also a novel that, if you push on kids when they're too young, I mean, if you'd said to me at 14, read this book, I would have thought this is the dumbest thing ever. I didn't have life experience. But when I read it as an adult, I was probably 40-something, I was astounded at this novel. And it's a hybrid because it's got a whole story and a broken story mixed together. The novel is not actually about Anna Karenina, right? She's the foil. She's the person who falls into the path of darkness and self-destruction. And the reason is to highlight the good, which is Levin and Katie, and how he pursues so hard to do good and to be good and to win her heart and to live in such a way as to please her and please God. And so when you see these two stories side by side, each gives the other more impact, more power. So you see a hybrid story like that can be very effective. You can also see kind of other forms of twisting that can take a good story and undermine it, right? Now, there's another concept in literature of archetypes. Archetypes are those kind of images or ideals or concepts that are laden with meaning, that carry a great deal of significance. Not because the author has to necessarily explain it all, but because culturally we all understand this. So, probably the most common archetypes are angels and dragons, right? So if you look kind of historically Western civilization, the dragon is an archetype for evil, Satan, Lucifer, the fallen one, right? The one who wants to devour your children and destroy your soul, right? That's the archetype of a dragon. And it was for a very, very long time. Okay, now, what happens when you start to undermine the archetype? I don't know exactly when it started. It could have been with this song. Puff the magic dragon lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. Now, that song may or may not be about marijuana. This has been debated. But what we do know is that dragons do not frolic. Dragons emerge from their lair full of hatred and malice with the intent to destroy just for the sake of destruction or revenge, like Smaug, right? Tolkien understood dragons because he had studied them, right? Beowulf, right? You go all the way back to Daniel and Bel, right? So when you start to change the archetype, it affects you semi-consciously, right? So now you don't have dragons being dragons archetypically, you have frolicking dragons, or you have trainable dragons, or you have neutral dragons, which is undermining the whole archetype and has a subtle impact on your psychology. This is explained in a book I highly recommend. It's called Landscape with Dragons by Michael O'Brien. I would consider him one of the best living authors today. He's Canadian. He wrote some apocalyptic fiction series, Father Elijah, historical fiction, Island of the Sun. He's a incredibly skilled writer. His nonfiction book, Landscape with Dragons, he unpacks this problem of archetypes. And when you say, oh, well, dragons aren't really evil, you can control the dragon, you can train the dragon, a dragon could be good or bad. Essentially, it's saying evil is neither good or bad. It's just something you can control. And this, of course, moves you into a very dangerous zone, and it's all semi-subconscious, right? So he talks about dragons. We see some other disordered archetypes that have popped up since dragons. Probably the one that is familiar to some of you, although I have never personally read one entire book, but that would be the Twilight series. So, okay, think about vampires as an archetype. What is the archetype of vampires? They are blood-sucking, undead creatures who will infect you with the worst possible disease that you could ever get, which is to live forever in a human body on earth and never see the face of God. That's like the worst thing that could happen to you, is to never die, right? And yet here we have a vampire. He doesn't really want to be a vampire. He's like a vegetarian vampire. Right now, you could make an argument. We all have a dark side, and it's okay to not want to be that. But if you look at it on an archetypical level, what's happening is you're changing the whole nature of the imagination on that. Now, one thing we see is the effect of literature on the imagination of what kids want to be interested in, right? So one of the side effects of the Twilight craze, there were girls showing up in emergency rooms of hospitals with chunks of flesh bitten out of their necks. Why? Well, my boyfriend wanted to show how much he loved me. It's very disordered. Now, that's obviously a rare case, but it shows you where the mind goes, right? One of the most important things about stories that you can ask when you're trying to figure out a story and a book or a series of books is, who do you identify with in the story? And by identifying with that character, what are you imagining yourself as being, right? And I find this kind of interesting because I remember that even into my late teens, I would fixate on characters in movies and walk around kind of daydreaming like I was that character. And, I think you outgrow this. I haven't done it recently, as far as I know, but I was kind of surprised to realize this particular movie that I'm thinking about, I had to have been at least 16 to get into the movie, and I was very fixated on that character. So this can happen. And I will say that books are generally more powerful than movies because you spend a whole lot longer contemplating them. Go see a movie, 2 hours, you're done. It has an impact, but you read a 300-page book, that's taking you a whole lot of time where you're in that world, thinking about it, imagining it, and all this. One of the things people ask me a lot about is Harry Potter, right? Because there's this Harry Potter craze. And I would say this is a tough one. There's a very well-respected Orthodox theologian who wrote a book called Finding God in Harry Potter. And I have had peers of mine, people I respect, people smarter than me, say, yes, you should read Harry Potter and, get all the good out of it. And I didn't, and I fell asleep during one of the movies that I accidentally started watching on an airplane. So I'm not an expert, but I will point out a few differences between, say, the world of Harry Potter and maybe the fantasy world of Tolkien or Lewis, because people will basically say, hey, it's the same. It's fantasy literature. Why are you picking on this? Okay, so let's look at a couple of the differences. The first thing you will notice is that in the world of Tolkien, right, who will you, as a reader, who will you identify with? Who do you imagine yourself being, right? Well, most people would probably identify with, I don't know, if you're ambitious and proud, maybe Aragorn. If you're super noble, maybe Sam. Frodo, if you just feel like you have uncarryable burdens. I guess if you're a girl, you'd have to go look for Galadriel or something, but you really don't imagine yourself being Elrond or Gandalf. Why? Because Tolkien somehow constructed that universe where it's not really lawful, it's not right, it's not within your range to lawfully identify. Though they're beyond you. So, you look at the characters and you think about it and you realize, wow, I mean, honestly, I'm probably more like Boromir. But you can't be Gandalf very easily, right? Okay, now you look at the Harry Potter world. Okay, who do you want to be like? Well, Harry and Hermione and the gang. You want to be one of them. You don't want to be one of the muggles who can't use the magic, right? So in Tolkien's world, you identify with people who do not have supernatural power except through intercession of magic, which would be grace, right? But in Harry Potter's world, then you get into this idea, I want to be like them and do magic. One of the side effects of the Harry Potter craze was kids all over the country, and this was widely reported, librarians having an extra high demand for books on how to do witchcraft, how to be a wizard, real magic, occult, right? Now, for most of your kids and kids we know, this is probably not a huge danger, but for some, it's drawing them through their imagination into what could be a very dangerous place. So you see, it traces the moral imagination. The other difference is, similar. In Tolkien, Gandalf does magic. The elves have some magic, right? But you have no idea how they do it, right? Gandalf can do what Gandalf does, right? And it's not even licit for you to know how he does that. It is outside the knowledge that should be available to you because he is a supernatural, archangelic archetype. Okay, in Harry Potter, she brilliantly uses huge chunks of Latin and will go on for 2 or 3 or more paragraphs on the mechanics of doing spells, right? So what happens is the reader will say, oh, wow, Gandalf did magic. Okay, story goes on. Over here, wow, I want to do a spell like that. Maybe if I learn Latin, I could, right? And this is the way kids think. So I'm not, saying never read Harry Potter or whatever, but I will say this. 50 years from now, if people are still reading anything, they'll still be reading Tolkien, and everyone will have forgot Harry Potter. It doesn't have that lasting classic impact. And of course, now J.K. Rowling, she's getting cancel culture, so, who knows? But so we look at that power of archetype. We look at where does the mind go? Because that's really what we're trying to cultivate is children being in stories and then placing themselves to say, would I, could I, should I, have I? Right? I had a really clear picture of this happen to me one time with my son. He was, I don't know, probably 9 or 10. I was reading to him Pinocchio. Okay, Pinocchio is weird. When you read Pinocchio, you think, this guy, Collodi, whatever his name is, he had to have been on drugs, right? How could he think of this weird stuff? It's just too blasted weird. And of course, the story of Pinocchio is Pinocchio does one stupid thing after another stupid thing, and he just keeps doing stupid thing again and again, and you're just exasperated by this story, right? Because he won't stop doing stupid things. So anyway, I had chosen this book to read to my son as a bedtime story. I had not read it before, so I wasn't quite sure what I was getting into. My wife was kind of overhearing parts of it as she's walking past his bedroom, and she finally says to me one night, "Do you think you should be reading that to him?" And I said, "Well, it is weird. I will admit that. But there's something here. So, yeah, I think it's okay." So she trusts me. So anyway, so we're getting to the point in the story where Pinocchio is going to do the most stupid thing, right? And you're just so frustrated. You're so frustrated. And I'm reading this, and you know it's going to happen, right? But you keep reading, and my son's lying on his bed with his eyes closed. And then he shouts out, "No, Pinocchio, don't do it!" And I thought, that is the power of this story. Because that is exactly what I want him to grow up and be able to do, is to be, no, stupid self, don't do that. And I will confide in you ladies, since you may not know this, but one of the problems of being male is that you never outgrow the capacity for doing stupid things. It's true. Some of the stupidest things I have done, I was well into my 5th decade of life. So I thought, okay, he is injecting himself into that story in a very healthy way. He's seeing himself and what you should not do. And of course, there's so much more going on in Pinocchio. It's really an amazing story because it's a story of supernatural grace and redemption. And one of the big differences between Disney. I grew up, you're old enough to remember Pinocchio, "When you wish upon a star," And in the real Pinocchio book, Pinocchio takes a shoe and smashes the talking cricket. He kills the cricket right there. And I was shocked. I was thinking, you just killed Jiminy Cricket. You can't do that. But then the ghost of the cricket comes back, and it's a very important moral piece to it, right? The other really interesting difference in the movie, it's Geppetto who really wants a real son, right? And that kind of drives things. In Pinocchio, the original, it's Pinocchio who wants to become a real boy. And he has to overcome all of his stupidness and all of his temptations, and has to be receptive to supernatural assistance and grace to bring repentance and redemption. His only way to become real. And of course, that's what we're all hoping for. So whether Collodi was on drugs or not is kind of irrelevant. He may have eaten the wrong kind of mushrooms at some point and had some visions that came out in the story, but there's a fabric to that story that's so powerful and so beautiful. Probably the best book that I read, and if I were going to recommend one book, this would be the one book, and it's called The Mysteries of Life in Children's Literature. The author is Mitchell Kalpagian, Kalpakgian. And this book is just beautiful. When I got the first copy of this book, I got a hardbound Do any of you really like hardbound books? It's just so nice. Anyway, I got the hardbound edition. I don't know if you can anymore. And I just read the simple, beautiful book, and it opened up a whole world of thought. I had the privilege later on of meeting Dr. Kalpagian. And actually, he came out to Oklahoma for a conference, and I got to drive him from the airport and back to the airport. He's passed on now a couple years, but he was just one of those amazing, insightful, humble, clear minds. So in his book, he talks about the mysteries. He talks about the mystery of wishes. And this is really important because, as a man thinketh, so he will be. Your wishes, that's your desire. Your desire drives your behavior. Your behavior makes you into who you are. So you better be careful what you wish for, because that's probably what you're going to get. And so in fairy tales, we see the use and misuse of wishes with correct consequences, right? What's also embedded in that is the redemption that can occur with the misuse of wishes when there's a repentance. The story of Midas, very, very old story. And of course, Midas is greedy and he wishes for gold, and he gets this supernatural power to change everything into gold, which is all going really well until he touches his daughter, who is the only thing that has more value to him. And he is completely devastated. And he repents, and then the mysterious supernatural being occurs and said, would you go back without the golden touch to the way things were? Midas said, I would do anything. And then everything goes back. He gets his daughter, and guess what? He's a good king. He's no longer greedy. He's loved by his people. You see the reward of luck and innocence. So you see this relationship between luck and innocence. Rumpelstiltskin, right? There's no way she could have ever known that, but because she was innocent and good, then she was able to have the salvation that came through that. So luck is generally a conduit for grace. Gratitude is a huge, huge theme in fairy tales. I love this story. It's what the old man does is always right. You know this story? All right, so, he takes his cow to town to sell it, but it's kind of like reverse. He gets the cow and then he trades it for a goat. I don't remember all the details. And he goes along on his path, and then he trades the goat, and he's convinced that the chicken is better. So he trades the goat for the chicken. Then he trades all the way down for a handful of beans or something. And he's at this inn, and he's telling the story to these two wealthy merchants about how he traded, and he's going to go home with whatever he's got, these handful of beans. And they're just like, your wife is going to kill you. And he says, no, she won't. She'll be happy. And they say, well, let's wager, right? So they bet, and then they go with him to his home, and he tells her the whole story, and she says, well, that was probably a good idea. Yeah, that was a right decision. Well, whatever you think is right, and yeah, okay, it's fine. He was stupid, but she didn't judge him. And then the merchants are so astounded, they give him a whole bunch of money, and he has redemption. So the story is not about him being stupid. It's about his wife being able to basically be happy with whatever stupid decision he makes, which I am profoundly grateful for my wife in this regard. Because I, as I have said, done some fairly stupid things, and I have not suffered a whole lot of judgment or persecution from her because of this. Death is a theme that was very present in children's literature for a long time. And in John Taylor Gatto's book, An Underground History of American Education, which you may be familiar with, he points out that right around the time that psychology took over education, psychology also had a huge impact on children's publishing, and that it was determined by the modern psychologists who don't really talk about the soul or supernatural or eternal everything, that children thinking about death was a negative thing. And so there was a gradual removal of death from books that were read to children. And I think this is, really an error. I will tell you the moment that I realized why this is such an error. So there was a man in our community that I knew very well, everyone knew him very well, and he died at not a very old age, very unexpectedly. He was kind of like everybody's happy uncle, right? And so we had a funeral, and it was an open casket, and I was watching all of the children standing around looking at his dead body. And I just thought, this is a profoundly good thing. This is a very good thing for children to see death here and present. And I realized I had not seen a dead body until that moment myself. I had lived over 50 years and never saw a real dead person. All my grandparents died. I have no idea. They just disappeared, right? Only in a movie, and that's not. And I just thought, wow, this is so good. Because think a minute, if you were the evil one and you wanted to cause someone to forget their death so that they could be tempted to live in sin, you would be very clever and wise to gradually remove the conscious awareness of mortality, right, from their thinking, from their world. And so I realized then that these stories, what's a horrible story, and it's an unfair story. It is definitely hard to read, probably healing. It was the most censored book from libraries in the 1970s. Bridge to Terabithia. That is so hard because by the time you get into that book, you love this girl so much. You love her like no one you've ever loved before. And then she dies. And it is so awful and hard. But guess what? He survives. The boy survives. Life goes on. So, contemplation of death. What else do we have? The mystery of goodness, right? A lot of stories. What do you have? You have the reward for goodness, the act of goodness bringing fruit. I taught for many years the story of the lion and the shepherd, or sometimes Androcles and the lion, where the shepherd pulls a thorn and then the shepherd gets arrested and thrown to the lions, and it's the same lion. And I've had kids rewrite that in war zones and science fiction and Middle Earth, right? I've had kids rewrite that story any number of times. And every time I read someone's retelling of that, I realize that is a reinforcement of the fact that doing good is in itself good. And if there isn't an immediate reward, there is a long-term gain. There's a long-term benefit, and not just to you, to the whole world. Beauty and the Beast, that's a good one, huh? The transformative power of love. And how many of us have used that? And we see a couple like, whoa, that's a Beauty and the Beast couple there. How did he ever get that girl, right? Well, all of us men should probably feel like that. Like, how did I ever get this girl? Purely because she saw something in me that I probably couldn't have even seen in myself. Other stories. Mysteries of truth. How about the Emperor's New Clothes? Right? There's a classic for you. And that's so deeply embedded in our thinking about the world today, right? We use it all the time in business and politics. And justice falls into this category. Did you ever notice children have this compelling need for justice? Like, as soon as they can talk, one of the things they want to tell you all the time is, that's not fair. And then you, in your years of wisdom, say, life is not fair. But it is just. Well, how do you know that? Because you may not have justice immediately, but you will have justice eventually. But children love it when evil gets its due rewards, right? In the original version of Snow White, the witch, the punishment for this witch, this is rich, she is forced to put on red-hot iron shoes and dance until she falls down dead. That's justice. I don't think it would fit in the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the Constitution, but nevertheless. And I guess we could finish, I mean, there's so many things, but probably, as Mitchell Kalkpigian said, of most importance for our world today is the mystery of home and children. And what you see, and Vigen Guroian talks about this, and a lot of really great people that I have heard talk about fairy tales, they will always point to the splendor in the ordinary, right? Where's the great adventure of life? Well, according to Chesterton, it's in the home. It's in the family. It's the goodness of unpacking. It's the day-to-day life of cooking and cleaning. And, well, you don't get a lot of diaper changing in fairy tales, but it's in there, right? And just the simplicity and goodness of the home. That's where, if we look for the great value, the great adventure, and we think, oh, we have to go here and go there and do something great, but no. We are essentially, we have the opportunity to live as a family, and there is no greater joy than that. And that comes out in the fairy tales. How many stories have started out? Once upon a time, there was a man and his wife, and what they wanted more than anything was a child, no matter how small, and that joy there. So in today's world, where children are pretty much all, by a certain age, unfortunately young, they become aware of the fact that some children are killed before they're born. And that is an incredibly jarring thing to a child. There's no 6-year-old child alive who would agree, oh yes, it's okay to kill a baby in its mother's tummy. No child would ever. That has to be inculcated strategically, nefariously over time to get to the point where a young woman would say that. No child would. And so all children are aware, right, that not all children are valued. And so when we have the stories of the value of home and children and life itself, that goes a long way, I would say, to cultivate the soil so the truth can grow well. There's much more that could be learned and talked about when it comes to fairy tales, and if this has piqued your interest, there are a few books that I would recommend you could use. So thank you so much.